Okay, welcome to me dragging the thing that the laptop is on so that, okay, to the first video class of the semester, the first of what will probably be two video lessons on British Romanticism. We've got the names of the so-called Big Six major British Romantics on the board behind me. Some names that you might have heard of, but not yet know what makes them important. We'll be finding that out over the course of this video and probably another one after it. William Blake, William Wordsworth, and Samuel Taylor Coleridge bringing up the first generation of British Romantics, and Lord Byron, Percy Shelley, and John Keats bringing up the second. If I make this close enough that you can see the blackboard, can you still see? Yeah, that works. Okay. Now, well, you've already ascertained that Romanticism takes up two of the seven poetry packets, and that we bother dividing it into two generations, even though we are not, when we talk about the Romantic era, talking about that much time. When we say Romanticism, what we're really talking about is the last couple of decades of the 1700s and the first couple of decades of the 1800s. But we are talking about a period that had a outsized impact on the history of poetry as an art form. Just as, by way of analogy, if this were a popular music class, if this were a class on the history of popular music, we would spend a disproportionate amount of time on the 1960s, because so much of the most important stuff was written and recorded then, and because it had such an outsized influence on everything that came after. We might think of the Romantic era as being somewhat analogous to that. Romanticism, the Romantic era, the last couple of decades of the 1700s, first couple of decades of the 1800s, are to the history of poetry something like as the 1960s is to the history of popular music. You can see by the years in parentheses after their names that the lives of these six people did overlap. The people in the second generation only, 2 decades and change younger than the people in the first. So these would have been, these guys would have been reading these guys when they were teenagers and been fans of them and then grown up to do their own thing. So why do we even bother dividing it into 2 generations? Well, because though there were enough important similarities for us to refer to the whole shebang as Romanticism, there are also enough important differences between both the first and second generations, and all of these people as individuals for us to bother dividing it up as well. So before we get to any of these people individually, I still don't like the angle that this is at. I suppose I'll learn to live with it. Before we get to what makes, oh, well, now you can't see the top of my head. Oh, I guess it's not necessary. Before we get to what makes any of these people important as an individual, let's look at some commonalities across all of the poems that we saw in these 2 packets. Start compiling, in short, a list of, what we might call romantic preoccupations. What is it that we're talking about when we say Romanticism, and how is it, well, different from what we'd already seen in the previous packets? John Donne and his Flea was an example of what we called metaphysical poetry, what was going on in the early 1600s. Now, this was linked with what was going on historically at that time. We were coming out of the Renaissance, and it was a time of uncertainty with religious belief versus this new science thing that a lot of people are getting into, and we saw how a poem like Donne's Flea, in addition to being an amusing sort of unnecessarily complex sex joke, also spoke to the concerns of its time by illustrating the absurdity of trying to square the circle vis-a-vis science and religion. You know, look how silly an idea we end up with when we apply logic and reason and the scientific method to a spiritual idea, hence metaphysical poetry. Similarly, Alexander Pope and his Essay on Man from the early 1700s, neoclassical poetry, as we called it, coincided with what was known as the Enlightenment and obsession with logic and reason and science, so extensive that even poets got in on the act. And we saw in the person of someone like Pope a style of poetry that has, from today's perspective, more in common with an argumentative essay that has, you know, a thesis statement and supporting points, is trying to convince the reader of something. It just, you know, happens to rhyme while it's doing it. These pieces were interesting to look at, but they were, or are, very different from what most people think of when they hear the word poetry today. A lot of the stuff that people automatically imagine when they hear the word poetry today really begins with Romanticism at the tail end of the 1700s, beginning of the 1800s. The idea that the primary or even the sole duty of a poem is to express emotion. Now, this is something that's so automatic these days, we don't even have to think about it. You can go into an elementary school classroom and say, you know, what is the point of a poem? And all the kids will say, it expresses emotion. Believe it or not, this idea that the poet is speaking as themselves, and that the main thing the poem is doing is expressing how they feel, is only a little over 200 years old. We saw how before that it was different. In John Donne's poem, he is not writing as himself, but rather playing point. So the idea that poetry is primarily concerned with not just the expression of emotion, but with the uncontrollable overflow of emotion, right? The idea of the artist as being almost a victim of his or her own uncontrollable emotions. The idea of the artist, not just as someone who is smarter than you necessarily, but someone who is more sensitive than you, right? Whose emotions are more finely attuned to stuff than the average person's are, right? Before Romanticism, you ask people, you know, what is an artist like? What is a writer or a poet like? They say smart, educated, learned. From Romanticism forward, the answer to the question, what is a poet like, is no longer necessarily smart, but rather sensitive. The same idea we have today. So poetry as being concerned with powerful emotion, and the emotion, it should be said, isn't necessarily romantic love, though it can be. We see the word romanticism, and we think of, you know, our word romantic today, meaning having to do with love. You do romantic stuff on Valentine's Day, which we learned last time was accidentally invented by the Middle English poet Geoffrey Chaucer due to his misconceptions about birds. Anyway, romantic in the sense of Romanticism does not necessarily mean specifically having to do with love, but having to do with any powerful emotion. It could be love, but it could also be depression or anger at injustice, and so on. It might even be useful to use an old-fashioned word here and not just say powerful emotions, but rather the passions. Passion, again, is a word that today we associate with sexuality or specifically romantic love. But it might be useful here to think of passion in its old-fashioned sense of suffering, passion in the religious sense, when in Christianity they talk about the passion of Christ. This is suffering during the tortures that preceded the crucifixion. So passion in that sense, the artist as someone who is a now I want the camera to be farther away than it is. The artist as someone who is a victim of his own uncontrollable emotions or passions is one of the key pillars of Romanticism. If we're looking at thematically, not just mood-wise, but what kind of stuff do we find coming up over and over in these packets? One of the commonalities we see is a concentration on or affinity for capital N nature. Again, this is something that from a modern perspective, we just assume poetry has a way that poetry has always been. Haven't poets always talked about, going around in the woods and appreciating all the pretty flowers and such? Well, no. The idea that poetry is about flowers and rainbows and stuff like that is, once again, only a little over 200 years old, and we have Romanticism to thank for it. Again, there is a historical reason why this is. Romanticism, like the sort of hippies of the 1960s, had a big back to nature emphasis. Now, the reason this didn't happen before the end of the 1700s, beginning of the 1800s, is because it didn't need to. We talked about metaphysical poetry coming out of the Renaissance, neoclassical poetry coming out of the Enlightenment. Well, Romanticism was a side effect of the thing they had after the Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution. That obsession with science during the Enlightenment led to a bunch of stuff getting invented, and the stuff that got invented, as tends to happen, quickly got monetized. And by the beginning by the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th, you have factories springing up everywhere, big cities springing up around those factories for the first time in history in this part of the world, Western Europe and the English-speaking part of the world. You've got a majority of the population living in cities rather than, living out in nature and being farmers as they always had been. There was no need for a back to nature movement. Let's take some time to appreciate the trees and flowers before this period in history, because people didn't need to get back to nature. They were already there. So humans being distant from nature, kids going for their whole childhood without ever climbing a tree, right? Because they lived in a big city where there were none, was a new problem. So this goes hand in hand with Romanticism's emphasis on emotion, right? It's emotion as opposed to logic and reason, right? Logic and reason and science was how we ended up inventing all those things that caused us to build the factories and the cities and make the trees go away. So there was a sense of, even if we can't logically explain, right, even if we can't prove with science what the point of smelling a flower or staring at a rainbow is, maybe that doesn't necessarily mean that these things are worthless. Maybe there's a reason that we don't want to totally get rid of all of the flowers and the rivers and the rainbows, even if we can't logically explain what the point of them is. It's the idea that these things are important is something that we feel in our hearts rather than prove with mathematics and with our minds. And I guess in keeping with both of those ideas, the third, I suppose, pillar of Romanticism is a focus on youth or childhood. That's something that we're seeing come up again and again in these packets. Sort of a division there between the first and second generation. When we say youth or childhood, this means for the first generation, usually an emphasis on being like an actual little kid, 7 or 8 years old, bounding down the hillside with the lambs, whereas the second generation tended to focus on youth in the sense of being a teenager, right? 15, 16, the ages of first beers and first kisses, rather than the age of jumping up and down and applauding whenever you see a fire engine, which is the idea of childhood that people like Blake and Wordsworth have in mind. So the short version, I suppose, is that when someone says Romanticism, you think powerful emotion, capital N nature, and the innocence of childhood. Right? The idea of, and this again goes hand in hand with a sort of, not that the movement was anti-intellectual, but a resistance to the human race putting all its eggs in the basket of fancy book learning, right? Whereas the preceding movement, the Enlightenment, would have thought of life as a process of gaining wisdom, right? That was a very important Enlightenment idea. Where do I have room on the board for it? Up here, I suppose. A term you might remember from social studies class, the tabula rasa, or blank slate, that we see in the political philosophy of people like John Locke or Jean-Jacques Rousseau. The idea that people are born neither good nor bad, but blank, and then we get filled in with whatever it is that society teaches us, just like a factory fresh computer that has no programs on it, and then what ends up on it is whatever you download onto it. Right now, this itself is an important advance over what had come before. Right, in the Middle Ages, everybody was obsessed with original sin. Right, we're born bad, we're born evil and sinful, and we need salvation through religion. And the Enlightenment comes along and says, well, we're not born bad, we're born nothing. And then we are whatever society makes us. A bad society will make us bad, a good society will make us good. Romanticism comes along after that and says, no, we're not born bad and we're not born neutral. We're born good and pure, and then we're corrupted by the evils of society. So life as and it's an idea we see all over pop culture these days, life as a process of losing innocence. So these posters that you see now, this all I really need to know I learned in kindergarten type of idea, that it's kids who really know what's going on, whether it is the innocence of a 6-year-old or the political idealism of a teenager. Right, the idea that it's young people who really know what's up, and then you become life is a process of becoming old and lame and uncool and forgetting, of selling out, right, and forgetting about what's really important in life. It's Romanticism that invents this idea, and that is an important philosophical and emotional precursor of what we think of as the rock and roll culture of a century and a half later. Okay, well, let's not go too much longer without looking at some actual poems. First up, right after another bite of my banana. First up, William Blake. So first page of the first Romanticism packet there, the one with a poison tree and the Garden of Love on the front. The first thing we might notice sticking out as different, compared to the stuff that we've seen come before from, half a century earlier from someone like Pope, is that before we even begin reading it, the poem is much less intimidating on the page. Shorter lines, fewer big words. When we start reading it, I was angry with my friend, I told my wrath did end. I was angry with my foe, I told it not, my wrath did grow. This could not be more unintimidating. Every line is end stopped. Every line begins with I. It's rhymed, A-A-B-B. Even the rhythm of the lines, da 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 da. 4 stresses per line rather than the more formal 5 stress line that we had seen over the preceding centuries. It feels almost like it's a nursery rhyme, like it's something for little kids. Even what it appears to be doing at first, teaching a moral lesson. If you're pissed at someone, talk it out with them, you'll feel better. This seems like it's something from, Dr. Seuss or, Highlights magazine, like it is a moral instruction for young children. But that's only the first stanza, and we've got 3 stanzas left. Okay, the antecedent of it in that first line, second stanza, would be wrath, anger. Okay, so the anger is getting watered. The angry tears that you cry are like the water on the plant of your anger. The fake smiles that you smile at the dude you secretly hate are like the sunshine on the plant of your anger. Third stanza. And it grew both day and night. Okay, so we're still with this my anger is a plant metaphor. Till it bore an apple bright. Okay, now the tree is the anger. What's the apple? We're getting pretty deep into this metaphor. We don't know exactly what the apple is. We knew what the tree was, it's the anger. We know what the water of the tree is, it's the tears. We know what the sunshine on the tree is, it's the fake smiles. By the time we get up to the apple, line 2, third stanza, there's not a clear answer. Something, an apple, a fruit, something has come about as a result of the anger, but we don't know what it is. Whatever it is, the enemy, the foe, knows about it. My foe beheld it shine, and he knew that it was mine. And into my garden stole when the night had veiled the pole. There's some kind of confrontation. In the morning glad I see my foe outstretched beneath the tree. Okay, suddenly at the end of the poem, there's a body. That's not a metaphor anymore. Wait a minute, William Blake, did you kill this dude? Is this a confession of murder? Now, William Blake did not, as far as we know, actually kill somebody. So he's still playing a game with the nature of the speaker here. But look at the bizarre 180 that this poem does. And we're talking about 16 brief lines here. What starts off as moral instruction, a thing that traditionally poetry would often have been, right? I'm an educated person who's going to drop some wisdom on you. It starts off that way. But by the end, it turns into what appears to be a confession of murder, and possibly not even one that the speaker is sorry for. In the morning glad I see, Well, is glad supposed to modify morning, like the glad morning, the happy morning? Or is the speaker saying he's glad the guy is dead? He's not sorry he killed him. So very morally ambiguous ending. The poem starts as though the speaker is above us. I know how to act, right? I was angry with my friend. I told my wrath did end. I was angry with my foe. I told it on my wrath did grow. I'm going to teach you a lesson. But by the end of the poem, the speaker appears to be someone who needs something from us, right? He is unburdening himself to us and wants our indulgence, absolution, forgiveness, whatever, right? So the speaker starts off up here, like a teacher or a dropper of wisdom, and ends up down here as someone who has something weighing on him, right? The point of the poem is, don't end up like me, right? The poem as warning, right? Or the idea of the poet as someone whose very identity is a cautionary tale, rather than, I know a bunch of important stuff. Listen to me. It becomes, oh, I'm all messed up. Don't end up like me. Right, the artist, the poet, as a victim of emotion or of passion, or as we see in the next poem occasionally, of society. Let's turn to the Garden of Love at the bottom of that page. I went to the Garden of Love and saw what I never had seen. Now, this is a quintessentially romantic way of opening a poem. Right? I went back to this place that I've been 1,000 times before, possibly when I was a little kid, but it's different now. Right? Sadness brought on by change. Things aren't the way they used to be, and I'm lamenting this. Is a very capital R romantic emotion. I went to the Garden of Love and saw what I never had seen, but here we get hit with a twist, right? A chapel was built in the midst where I used to play on the green. Normally, in a romantic poem, we would expect a change to nature, right? There was this place that was capital N nature, and then people went and messed with it. That's going to be bad. That's a bad thing. When people change nature, it's always bad. But here, the thing that people have done is build or erect a chapel, a small church. Well, isn't that good, right? Isn't a church a good thing? Well, maybe it depends on the type of church. Let's move on. Second stanza. And the gates of this chapel were shut, and thou shalt not rip o'er the door. So I turned to the Garden of Love that so many sweet flowers bore. Okay, so while under other circumstances, if people are going about it the right way, a church might be a good thing. This particular chapel, not going about it the right way. The gates are shut, right? They're not very welcoming. Thou shalt not is writ over the door, right? The words used to begin so many of the commandments, right? So it's religion with the emphasis on all of the stuff you're not supposed to do, right? Not on God's do that, don't do the other thing, or you'll get in trouble idea of religion, which Blake seems to be implying is the wrong way to go about things. So I turned to the Garden of Love that so many sweet flowers bore, and I saw it was filled with graves and tombstones where flowers should be. So he is using a deliberately biblical idea here, right? Death coming to the garden, as it did when Adam and Eve disobeyed God and ate the forbidden fruit, and thereby bringing knowledge of good and evil into the world. Wait a minute. If there wasn't knowledge of good and evil yet, how were they supposed to know that it was wrong to disobey God and eat the? Well, I guess it's not supposed to be taken literally. Anyway, death has come to the garden of love. Suddenly it's filled with graves and tombstones where flowers should be. And then we get this amazing final image in the last two lines. And priests in black gowns were walking their rounds and binding with briars my joys and desires. Note that the meter changes there. Just as, if you're dancing and you get used to a certain rhythm and then the DJ, record scratch, lets the beat drop, switches it up, you kind of take a false step and it really gets your attention. Blake changing the meter suddenly in those last two lines wakes you up and really calls your attention to this devastating final image. Priests in black gowns were walking their rounds. Suddenly it's there's a couple of extra beats in each line. There's internal rhyme, right? Gowns and rounds in the same line, briars and desires in the same line. Accompanying this devastating image of these cop-like, guard-like priests walking their rounds, like guards pacing back and forth in front of a castle, or cops on the beat, binding with briars my joys and desires. The briars, the thorns, symbolically Christ's crown of thorns, have become the handcuffs that these cop-like priests use to bind up your joys and desires. So it is not an anti-religious poem on the whole. We'll leave straight up anti-religion or atheism to the second generation romantics. More on them in a bit. Blake was a religious guy, but a unorthodox religious guy. The poem is not against religion, period, but rather against religion being done the wrong way, emphasizing the wrong things about God's creation. Wrapped up in this idea of people building something that destroys nature, right? Even if the thing you're building is a church. The idea here is, well, it's sort of ass backwards to say, we want to thank God for for creating all this beautiful nature, so we'll bulldoze the beautiful nature and put up a building that we go inside and shut the doors so we can't even see the beautiful nature outside, and then thank God inside the building, right? The capital R romantic idea would be, well, if you want to thank God, go walk around in the woods and do it. Don't go inside a building to do it. After all, God made the woods, people made the building. Okay. But if we want to know one poem and know one of these six poets is Romanticism all by itself or all by himself. Each one of them does important things that contribute to the central idea. But if you had to pick one poem that's, as close as you can get to Romanticism in a nutshell, the one that really kicks off or seems to emblematize the entire movement, designate one piece as the sort of smells like teen spirit of Romanticism, it would probably be this very long poem starting on the next page. The Intimations Ode, or to give it its full title, Ode, Intimations of Immortality from Recollections of Early Childhood, a joint that William Wordsworth drops in 1805. Okay, now it begins, there was a time, okay, so this is something we recognize as romantic. It is a poem of recollection, right? Things used to be one way, and now they're not that way anymore. presumably I am sad about this. There was a time when meadow, grove, and stream, the earth and every common sight, to me did seem apparelled in celestial light, the glory and the freshness of a dream. It is not now as it hath been of yore. Turn wheresoe'er I may, by night or day, the things which I have seen, I now can see no more. This is something we expect from Romanticism. There was a bunch of beautiful nature, and now the speaker cannot perceive it anymore. Okay, so what happened to it? Did they bulldoze it all to put up a Dave and Buster's or something? Let's find out. Second stanza. The rainbow comes and goes, and lovely is the rose. The moon doth with delight look round her when the heavens are bare. Waters on a starry night are beautiful and fair. The sunshine is a glorious birth, but yet I know where'er I go that there hath passed away a glory from the earth. So contrary to what we might have expected, in the second stanza, Wordsworth specifies, no, all the stuff is still there, right? It's not gone. It's not like in Blake's Garden of Love where the garden got raised with a Z to put up a chapel where a bunch of jerky priests in black gowns are binding things. Nature is still the same. That hasn't changed. So what has changed? This is the part where you would say Wordsworth himself. How has he changed? He grew up. Now, while the birds thus sing a joyous song, and while the young lambs bound as to the tabor sound, to me alone there came a thought of grief. A timely utterance gave that thought relief, and I again am strong. The cataracts blow their trumpets from the steep. No more shall grief of mine the season wrong. I hear the echoes through the mountains throng. The winds come to me from the fields of sleep, and all the earth is gay. Land and sea give themselves up to jollity, and with the heart of May doth every beast keep holiday. Thou child of joy, shout round. Let me hear thy shouts, thou happy shepherd boy. Ye blessed creatures, I have heard the call ye to each other make. I see the heavens laugh with you in your jubilee. My heart is at your festival. My head hath its coronal. The fullness of your bliss I feel it all. So the language takes some unpacking. He's doing these very long sentences with lots of modifying clauses and semicolons and dashes. The grammar can be hard to track. The fact that, unlike in Blake, we see wildly uneven lines here. The poem has this pulsating feel to it, where lines are alternately long, short, somewhere in between. It makes an immediate visual impression of like, whoa, this poem is going to be hard. And though grammatically it might be a bit challenging, he's not talking about anything that's so hard for us to suss out or to recognize. And this is largely because of how successful the ideas contained in the poem are, right? We recognize all over popular culture today in innumerable songs, movies, and shows, the idea of sitting somewhere, being older, sitting somewhere, watching the kids, play on what used to be your old playground. Oh, look, they're still playing that game that I played when I was their age, and taking a moment to sigh and lament the fact that you don't get to do that anymore as you continue on to go to work. That's something that we see all over the place so much these days that it's become a cliche. It hits us as cheesy now. Well, here it is being invented. Watching the kids play, seeing and hearing how happy they are, wishing you were still like that, and wondering, what the heck happened to me? How come I'm not like that anymore? Or as Wordsworth puts it, whither is fled the visionary gleam? Where is it now, the glory and the dream? this phrase in line, oh, what are we about, line 57 or so here, the visionary gleam, that glow of happiness, of something not just beautiful, but sacred, that everything appears to be bathed in when you're a little kid. Um, you know, running down a green and flowery hillside, waking up on Christmas morning, even something as simple as, seeing a fire engine go by. Look, mommy, a fire engine, and as an adult, you don't feel that way anymore. Where does that go? That excitement. We can use a phrase today like childhood innocence, but we've heard it so many times that it doesn't mean anything to us anymore. It goes in one ear and out the other. That's part of the point of poetry is you find new ways to put things that we haven't all heard a million times. And even though it takes a second, because you have to stop and think about it because you haven't heard it a million times, that actually makes it impact you more rather than having it go in one ear and out the other. So when Wordsworth talks about the common sights of nature seeming apparelled in celestial light, when you're a kid, referring to it as the visionary gleam, because these phrases are new to us, they actually have a shot at making an impact on us. So I would say the first movement of the poem sets up the problem. I used to see all this beauty in nature. I don't see it anymore. It's not because the nature is not there. It's still the same as it always was, but I'm different. Why am I different? Because I grew up and I don't see in nature, I don't feel the same inspiration that I felt in it when I was a little kid. Why did that happen? That sets up the problem and the question. Starting in line 59, the "Our birth is but a sleep and a forgetting" stanza, things get a little more complex because Wordsworth takes a stab at answering the question. The problem itself is something that has occurred to all of us. How come I don't see as much beauty in the world around me as I did when I was a little kid? How come I don't get as excited about stuff as I did when I was young? Wordsworth takes a stab at answering that in a way that is a little more idiosyncratic, I suppose. Our birth is but a sleep and a forgetting. Okay, right off the bat, that's weird. Normally, in a poem, death is the thing that's sleep, right? Poets are always comparing death to sleep. Comparing birth to sleep? Wait, if you go to sleep when you're born, what the heck does that even mean? When were you awake? Well, keep reading and find out. The soul that rises with us, our life star, hath had elsewhere its setting, and cometh from afar, not in entire forgetfulness, and not in utter nakedness, but trailing clouds of glory do we come from God who is our home. So, according to Wordsworth, we're not just in heaven with God after we die, which would have been the normal religious idea, the standard Christian idea of his place and time, late 17th century, early 19th century England. He's borrowing an idea from the ancient Greeks, borrowing an idea from Plato, that our souls are in heaven, or as Plato would have put it, in the realm of ideal forms, not just after we die, but before we're born as well. So we are born with certain knowledge. Plato would have called this, metaphysical knowledge, right? That's how we know that all of the imperfect different types of cat are all cats, how all of the imperfect different types of tree are all trees, because they possess catness and treeness. And we know this because we have a memory of the ideal cat and the ideal tree, from when our souls abided in the realm of ideal forms before we were born into this imperfect world. Wordsworth is borrowing this ancient Greek, this Platonic idea, and incorporating it into his early 1800s Anglicanism. In a way that makes the poem something of a diss track against the Enlightenment, and specifically its idea of the tabula rasa, the blank slate. Wordsworth is saying, hell no to the blank slate. We are not born with nothing. We are born, right? We are born not in utter nakedness. He says right there. That is an explicit counter-argument to the tabula rasa, the blank slate idea. Rather than being born in entire forgetfulness or utter nakedness, trailing clouds of glory do we come from God who is our home. Heaven lies about us in our infancy. So, according to Wordsworth, and whether he believed this literally or it was just a cool metaphor he came up with to explain something unexplainable, namely the childhood capacity to find beauty in everything. I don't know. But the theory he advances here is that we're also with God before we're born. So when we're little kids, when we're babies and when we're children, our memory of God and heaven and divine things and divine truth is fresher. Right, God juice or God dust is still kind of all over us, and it affects how we see everything when we're small children. And then the process of getting old and lame, not lame in the sense of crippled, but lame in the modern sense of uncool, is because we forget that. So this is a perfect example of the capital R romantic idea of, rather than life being a process of gaining wisdom, right? You're born with no intelligence and then you go to school and read books, and by the time you're old, you have wisdom and people should listen to you, right? Young people should listen to old people because they have wisdom. This is the romantic reversal of that idea. You're born with a superior comprehension of beauty and magic and wonder and innocence and all the things that really matter. And then life is a process of getting old and uncool and forgetting all of that. So it's old people who should shut up and listen to young people. Shades of the prison house begin to close upon the growing boy. The prison house meaning earth, this world. But he beholds the light, and whence it flows, he sees it in his joy. The youth who daily farther from the east must travel still is nature's priest, and by the vision splendid is on his way attended. Okay, so when you're a little kid, when you're a baby, right, you see divine light and divine truth and divine whatever it is everywhere. When you get a little older than that, you still see it at certain moments when you are joyful. The youth, he says, daily farther from the east must travel. So just as the sun rises in the east and sets in the west, he's saying a human life, rises with a fresh memory of heaven that then fades, where we get farther from the east as we grow. When you're a youth, you still are nature's priest, he puts it. At length, the man perceives it die away and fade into the light of common day. By the time you're a grown-up, you have totally lost the ability to see that divine light anywhere, and there's just the plain old regular scientifically explainable light of not electric light yet in 1805, but of the sun and gas lamps and the boring kind of scientifically explainable light that we see by in the classroom. The stanza beginning around line 86, behold the child among his newborn blisses, illustrates the irony, the bitter irony of child. We see here the image of the child on the floor drawing. See where mid-work of his own hand he lies. See at his feet some little plan or chart, some fragment from his dream of human life shaped by himself with newly learned art. Then will he fit his tongue to dialogues of business, love, or strife, but it will not be long ere this be thrown aside, and with new joy and pride the little actor cons another part, filling from time to time his humorous stage with all the persons down to palsied age that life brings with her in her equipage, as if his whole vocation were endless imitation. So, what's the irony here? When you're a kid, you know what's really important. You have more divine truth in you than the adults do. But what do you spend your whole childhood wishing? That you were a grown-up, right? When you're a kid, everything is, mommy, when will I be old enough to do this? Daddy, when will I be allowed to do that? You can't stop talking about what you're going to be when you grow up. The child in this stanza is drawing pictures of grown-up things. A wedding or a festival, a mourning or a funeral, dialogues of business, love, or strife, as if his whole vocation were endless imitation. He spends all his time imitating and wishing he could be like the grown-ups, not knowing how good he has it when you're a kid. That's the universal. I realize you're not supposed to call stuff universal anymore, but I think if anything can be called universal, it's this. You're a little kid. You spend all your time wishing that you could be a grown-up. Then you finally become a grown-up, realize it sucks, but then it's too late, and you can't go back to being a kid again. You didn't know how good you had it when you were a little kid, and by the time you realize how good you had it, it's over and you're not a kid anymore. You can only realize what you had in childhood by losing it. In the next stanza, beginning around line 109, Wordsworth begins addressing the figure of the child. Thou whose exterior semblance doth belie thy soul's immensity. Great phrase. Let's pause and appreciate what that means. Thou, the fancy old-fashioned you, thou whose exterior semblance doth belie thy soul's immensity. Exterior semblance would be outward appearance. To belie would be to contradict or not match or jibe with. Thy soul's immensity would be the largeness of your soul. So when Wordsworth says to the child that your exterior semblance doth belie your soul's immensity, he's saying that what you look like doesn't match your soul, right? You are physically small, but your soul is much bigger. So he's drawing almost in a 200 years earlier John Donne sense, a metaphysical contrast, right? Between how big you are physically and how big you are spiritually. Little kids have small bodies but big souls. The implication would be that, by contrast, grown-ups have big bodies but small souls. Thou best philosopher who yet dost keep thy heritage, thou eye among the blind. Right, the idea that it's the child who can see what the rest of us cannot see. Now, here's something you've been told 1,000 times by your parents and by other adults when you were young, though I guess not in this exact language. When Wordsworth says, Thou little child, yet glorious in the might of heaven-born freedom on thy being's height, why with such earnest pains dost thou provoke the years to bring the inevitable yoke, thus blindly with thy blessedness at strife? Full soon thy soul shall have her earthly freight, and custom lie upon thee with a weight heavy as frost and deep almost as life. Might take you a few seconds to think about, but it's something you've heard before. Thou little child, why with such earnest pains dost thou provoke the years to bring the inevitable yoke? Why are you in such a hurry to grow up? Why do you provoke the years? Thus blindly with thy blessedness at strife. In other words, you don't know how good you have it when you're a kid. Full soon thy soul shall have her earthly freight. It'll happen before you know it, right? When you're a kid and your parents or other grown-ups tell you, don't be in such a hurry to grow up, it'll happen before you know it. Here it is, back in 1805. Don't be in such a hurry to grow up. It'll happen before you know it. You don't know how good you have it when you're a kid. Being grown up is not as great as you think it's going to be. Thou little child, yet glorious in the might of heaven-born freedom on thy being's height, why with such earnest pains dost thou provoke the years to bring the inevitable yoke, thus blindly with thy blessedness at strife? Full soon thy soul shall have her earthly freight, and custom lie upon thee with a weight heavy as frost and deep almost as life. We've heard it 1,000 times in other language. I like Wordsworth's way a bit better. I think it sounds a little cooler, but we all get the basic idea. We've heard it before. And again, the reason we've heard it before is because this poem and other ideas from the Romantic movement were so successful that it became stuff that people started saying, and now we hear it all over the place. Moving into the last last movement of the poem here, starting around line 134. We begin to get a little more hopeful, right? Being a grown-up isn't all bad, right? It's not all bad news. Oh, joy that in our embers is something that doth live, that nature yet remembers what was so fugitive. So in our embers, right? What are embers? Those are the glowing coals, right, that are left after the fire is out. And that can be, if you throw in some twigs and paper and blow on them, kindled. So he's saying, okay, I'm an adult now. I'm old, and he wasn't that old when he wrote this poem. He was 35 or so, but in capital R romantic terms, that's old. These guys were dead by that age. The good news is, once you're not a kid anymore, at least you're finally able to appreciate what it meant to be a kid. You can't appreciate childhood when you are a child, but once you're an adult, you can finally appreciate it and give childhood its due, right? You couldn't write this poem when you're a kid. You can run around on the hillside with the lambs and feel the full beauty and glory of childhood, but to actually appreciate it, you have to lose it. The thought of our past years in me doth breed perpetual benediction. It's only once you've grown up and lost childhood that you can appreciate it. In a season of calm weather, he begins around line 166, in a season of calm weather, though inland far we be, our souls have sight of that immortal sea which brought us hither, can in a moment travel thither and see the children sport upon the shore and hear the mighty waters rolling evermore. So even though he is saying, I'm old now and I will never get to, cavort on the hillside with the lambs and the robins and trees and flowers in the sunshine like I did when I was 7, I can still watch my own kids or watch other people's kids do that and remember what it was like to be that age. And the loss of that, in a way, is even more beautiful. For my own part, though I know I will never again be as happy, as purely joyful for any reason as I was, on Christmas morning when I was a small child. I can now watch my daughter, watch my 5-year-old daughter feeling that way on a Christmas morning, and in a way, that emotion, though it's not as giddy, not as manic, in a way, that emotion of watching your own kid, watching it be another kid's turn to feel that way once you're old and your time has passed, is in a way a deeper and a more profound emotion, albeit a sadder one, than being a kid and feeling that way yourself was. This turns us now to, or this sparks the most famous lines from the poem, lines 180 through about 191. The splendor in the grass part that you often hear quoted out of context. What though the radiance which was once so bright be now forever taken from my sight? Though nothing can bring back the hour of splendor in the grass, of glory in the flower, we will grieve not, rather find strength in what remains behind, in the primal sympathy which, having been, must ever be, in the soothing thoughts that spring out of human suffering, in the faith that looks through death, in years that bring the philosophic mind. Now, if those lines sound familiar, you might have heard them, maybe in a movie or a TV show, or possibly in real life at a funeral or something, recited as a poem of mourning or a poem of remembrance for the dead. And out of context, indeed, it sounds like, when you hear those lines by themselves, that must have been what the poet had in mind. In the context of the larger poem, we see that though they might be called a sort of mourning, it's not mourning for another person who has literally died, but rather mourning for a part of yourself that has figuratively died. The absence or the death of something that you had inside you when you were a little kid and no longer have inside. And in the final movement, O ye fountains, meadows, hills, and groves, forebode not any severing of our loves, yet in my heart of hearts I feel your might. Wordsworth begins to close by saying, nature, I'm still with you. I'm still on your side, even if I don't run around acting like it the way I did when I was a kid. I only have relinquished one delight, to live beneath your more habitual sway. I love the brooks which down their channels fret, even more than when I tripped lightly as they. I appreciate nature even more now that I have lost and can reflect on the loss of what I had when I was a child. The clouds that gather round the setting sun do take a sober coloring from an eye that hath kept watch o'er man's mortality. Right, the idea that you as Joni Mitchell would put it a century and a half later, don't know what you've got till it's gone, right? That's when you really appreciate what had been, right? The clouds that gather round the setting sun, just as the sunset is the most beautiful time of day, right? When the sun is high in the sky, when it's noon, you don't appreciate it because you're running around doing noon stuff. It's the sunset that's beautiful because you know that in just a few moments it will be dark and it makes the sunlight more precious. Another race hath been, and other palms are won. Right? I'm not greedy. I had my turn to be a kid, now it's someone else's turn. But thanks to the human heart by which we live, thanks to its tenderness, its joys and fears, to me, the meanest flower that blows can give thoughts that do often lie too deep for tears. In other words, you can reflect upon all of this if you keep it not in your head, right? He's not expecting you to memorize this entire poem. That would be too intellectual a way of going about things. But remember the point of it. Keep the point of the poem in your heart, and you'll be able to feel it all whenever you gaze upon the meanest flower that blows. Any random little flower can call all of this to your mind if you hold it in your heart. Okay, to turn now to the third of the major first generation Romantics, Wordsworth's buddy Samuel Taylor Coleridge. And he is here to remind us that Romanticism is not all hearts and flowers and lambs. There is a dark side to it. And in few poems is the dark side of Romanticism more unforgettably realized than in Coleridge's Kubla Khan, a poem that was so weird Wordsworth wouldn't let him put it in their first book. And they put out a book together in 1798 called Lyrical Ballads, which did a lot to crystallize the idea of Romanticism as a movement. Right before them, there had been William Blake, of course, but it wasn't a movement yet. It was just William Blake being William Blake. It was when, by the 1790s, the two of them got in on the act that people started to notice, oh, this Romanticism is this thing that's happening that lots of people are doing. Now, Coleridge had written this poem, Kubla Khan, in the 1790s, and Wordsworth said, no, man, this poem is too weird. They're going to think we're all on drugs. We can't, we can't put it in the book. Coleridge said, fine, stuck in a drawer and forgot about it. A couple of decades later, when the second generation guys came along at a party or someplace, Coleridge showed the poem to Lord Byron. I thought, well, that Byron guy's weird. Maybe he'll dig that poem I wrote about Kubla Khan. Showed it to Byron. Byron flipped. Oh my God, this is the best thing you've ever done. F. Wordsworth published it immediately. And at Byron's great insistence, Coleridge finally did publish the poem in about 1814 or so, nearly 20 years after he'd written it. Because so much of the poem is its sound, I'm going to, after another sip of lemon water, read the whole thing aloud so we can really get into it, and then we'll devote a few words to what the heck it meant. In Xanadu did Kubla Khan a stately pleasure dome decree, where Alph, the sacred river, ran through caverns measureless to man down to a sunless sea. So 5 miles of fertile ground, with walls and towers were girdled round, and there were gardens bright with sinuous rills, where blossomed many an incense-bearing tree. And here were forests ancient as the hills, enfolding sunny spots of greenery. But oh, that deep romantic chasm which slanted down the green hill athwart a cedarn cover, a savage place, as holy and enchanted as ere beneath a waning moon was haunted by woman wailing for her demon lover. And from this chasm, with ceaseless turmoil seething, as if this earth in fast thick pants were breathing, a mighty fountain momently was forced, amid whose swift half-intermitted burst huge fragments vaulted like rebounding hail, or chaffy grain beneath the thresher's flail. And mid these dancing rocks, at once and ever, it flung up momently the sacred river, 5 miles meandering with a mazy motion. Through wood and dale the sacred river ran, then reached the caverns, measureless to man, and sank in tumult to a lifeless ocean. And mid this tumult Kubla heard from far ancestral voices prophesying war. The shadow of the dome of pleasure floated midway on the waves, where was heard the mingled measure from the fountain and the caves. It was a miracle of rare device, a sunny pleasure dome with caves of ice. A damsel with a dulcimer in a vision once I saw. It was an Abyssinian maid, and on her dulcimer she played, singing of Mount Abora. Could I revive within me her symphony and song, to such a deep delight 'twould win me, that with music loud and long I would build that dome in air, that sunny dome, those caves of ice, and all who heard should see them there, and all should cry, beware, beware his flashing eyes, his floating hair, weave a circle round him thrice, and close your eyes with holy dread, for he on honeydew hath fed, and drunk the milk of paradise. Okay, sounded amazing. What exactly did it mean? Well, as we discussed last time, let the music do its work before you even worry about the meaning. Just as with a song, where the sound of the instruments, the key to the purely sonic elements of the song will help narrow down what it's about and how you should be feeling before the singer even says anything. Right? There's the sound of the music and there's the meaning of the words, and they combine to create the effect of the song. Same thing with a poem, even though all we have is words. The loopy rhyme scheme, it's rhyming, constantly, but not in any kind of regular pattern. Same deal with the meter. It's got a very insistent beat to it, especially with those long strings of what's called feminine rhyme, right? 2-syllable words where the last syllable is identical, like seething and breathing, or slanted, enchanted, and haunted, cover and lover. In the beginning of the second stanza, it creates this very hypnotic, almost trippy or psychedelic effect, before kind of getting a bit spacier. Look at how in those last couple of stanzas the lines get shorter, the stresses get more spaced out. We have a sort of a big burst of action in the second stanza that then sort of whoosh calms down and is reflected upon after that. So it is what we call a narrative poem, at least for most of it until the very end. Right? A narrative poem is a poem that tells a story. Where do I even have room to do this. Right. Most poems, at least from a modern point of view, most poems are what we call lyric poems, Lyric. That's a poem that expresses an emotion. I feel this way, I feel that way. Occasionally, we run into what's called a narrative poem, a poem that tells a story about a series of events. Although Coleridge's Kubla Khan is arguably a lyric by the end, where the first person is kind of brought in at the buzzer in the last stanza. For most of the first part of the poem, it's telling us a story, and it's telling us a story about an actual historical figure. So, who was Kubla Khan? For those who don't know, he was the grandson of Genghis Khan, the Mongol warlord from the 13th century. Kubla Khan, his grandson, expanded the empire to an even greater extent, presided over the largest contiguous land empire that the world has ever seen. So we are talking about an extremely powerful guy, someone who was, in his time, the single most powerful person on the face of the earth, the great Emperor Kubla Khan. Now, according to legend, he built not his administrative capital, but his sort of weekend place, a decadent and beautiful party palace, according to legend, in a secret valley, sometimes known as Shangri-La, if that term sounds familiar, but also known as Xanadu. According to legend, the secret valley, the hidden valley of Xanadu, was the most beautiful place on the face of the earth. And Kubla Khan built his party palace there, his stately pleasure dome, as Coleridge puts it, and kept its location a secret. In Xanadu did Kubla Khan a stately pleasure dome decree. We see at the end of the first stanza that twice 5 miles of fertile ground with walls and towers were girdled round. So he is enclosing it, fencing it in, trying to keep it all to himself. We know enough about Romanticism by now to know that when someone tries to fence in or wall in nature, this is not a good thing. It's not going to go well. But so far in Blake and in Wordsworth, all that happens when somebody ruins nature by fencing it in is that a poet sees them do it and gets really sad and writes a poem. What we see happen here for the first time is capital N nature fighting back. This is not going to work out well for Kubla Khan. We're told that Alf, the sacred river, ran through this valley. Through caverns measureless to man, down to a sunless sea. So the idea of the sacred river running through the caverns measureless to man, something beyond human comprehension or understanding, more powerful even than a great emperor like the warlord Kubla Khan. He may be powerful in human terms, but he's not more powerful than capital N nature. He's not more powerful than Alf, the sacred river. And so what we see in the second stanza is Alf, the sacred river, rise up to punish him. Right? Because Xanadu is not just beautiful, it is a savage place, as holy and enchanted as e'er beneath a waning moon was haunted by woman wailing for her demon lover. So it possesses not just beauty, but a power, a savage power, something that can get you, something that can bite you in the ass if you fail to respect it. So the idea of nature, capital N nature, as not just something beautiful, the flowers and the rainbows and the lambs of Wordsworth, not just something to be appreciated, but nature as something to be feared and respected. We're talking about, in short, the Romantic. What's called the Romantic Sublime. Now, this is yet again a word that has kind of changed meanings. Today, sublime just means, oh, how sublime! Like that's really good. But we want to be thinking of the word sublime here as being related to the word subliminal. When people talk about a subliminal message, it's in a song, or a frame in a commercial for a fraction of a second that says go buy such and such a product, and you don't realize that you saw it, but suddenly you're hungry for that product and you don't know why. Subliminal, under the limit, right below the threshold of understanding, something that you perceive subconsciously. The Romantic sublime is the power behind nature, right? There is nature, what we see, the nature that we see in day-to-day life, pretty flowers and beautiful sunsets, but there is something behind it, behind the veil of reality, that can reveal itself at any time and get us if we're not careful. The dark side of nature. Now, so because Kublai Khan, the great warlord, in his pride, his hubris, to use the fancy English class word for pride, thought he was more powerful than nature itself, and fenced in the sacred valley of Xanadu, walled it in, Alf, the sacred river, rises up to punish him. A mighty fountain momently was forced, amid whose swift half-intermitted burst huge fragments vaulted like rebounding hail or chaffy grain beneath the thresher's flail. The sacred river rises up through the floor of the great Khan's party palace and starts wrecking the place. It's always reminded me of the end of a James Bond movie where the villain's volcano lair or whatever is getting wrecked. Ninjas are rappelling down from the ceiling while a disembodied computer voice is going at T minus 10, 9, 8. It's chaos. And as suddenly as it had appeared, the sacred river, whoosh, having done its work and punished Kublai Khan, sinks back down into the caverns measureless to man, and leaves Kubla saying, amid the ruins of his palace, wondering what the hell was that. And mid this tumult, Kubla heard from far ancestral voices prophesying war. The voices of his ancestors foretelling the ruin and collapse of his empire. Well, what are they so happy about? If they're his ancestors, shouldn't they be on his side? Well, no. Being dead, they are now a part of nature, and so by disrespecting nature, Kubla has also disrespected them. Now, just as that sort of all I really need to know I learned in kindergarten vibe that we saw in Wordsworth is something that we recognize is a successful idea, a successful meme that we see all over the wider culture today. This idea is something that we have seen before as well, not on inspirational posters, but in horror movies, right? How many horror movies have we seen where somebody builds their house or their hospital or whatever it is on an Indian burial ground, or some other type of land that is supposedly sacred or haunted, or shouldn't be disrespected, shouldn't be messed with, and the people think, oh, I don't need to care about that silly old superstition. I'm rich, or I'm powerful, or I'm logical, or whatever it is. I'm going to build my house or my hospital or my school or whatever it is on this supposedly sacred, supposedly haunted land anyway. And of course, wacky, scary stuff starts happening, and they quickly realize that this was a bad idea. This is the first iteration of that concept of what would a century and change later become the I built my such and such on the Indian burial ground idea from so many horror movies. Kubla Khan thought he was more powerful than nature, and he didn't have anything to fear from Alf the Sacred River. He built his party palace there. He built his stately pleasure dome in the wrong place, and capital and nature rose up to punish him. So nature is not just something beautiful. Smell the pretty flowers, look at the beautiful rainbow. It is also something dark, something potentially destructive, something to be respected, something even to be feared. Now, the story of Kubla Khan and getting punished by the sacred river ends after the first three stanzas. In the fourth stanza, we get, for the first time in the poem, the first person. A damsel with a dulcimer in a vision once I saw. Suddenly it's personal. It was an Abyssinian maid on her dulcimer she played, singing of Mount Abora. So this vision that this vision that the poet is having, feels like some kind of personification of nature, as though it is perhaps Alf the Sacred River taking another form, taking the form of a beautiful young woman singing and playing on a dulcimer. And in these closing lines, we get something unexpected, possibly unadvisable. Could I revive within me her symphony and song? To such a deep delight 'twould win me that with music loud and long I would build that dome in air. That sunny dome, those caves of... Wait a minute. I thought the point of the poem was you weren't supposed to do that. Right? Kubla Khan wasn't supposed to build a stately pleasure dome in the valley of Xanadu. It's as though the poet has failed to learn the lesson of his own poem, and has a vision of becoming some kind of super poet. All should cry, beware, beware, his flashing eyes, his floating hair, weave a circle round him thrice, and close your eyes with holy dread, for he on honeydew hath fed, and drunk the milk of paradise. So marvelously, we see this surprise ending where the poet, where the speaker fails to heed the warning of his own poem. Kind of like what we saw an hour and a half ago from William Blake in The Poison Tree, where it starts off like he's teaching you a lesson. I was angry with my friend. I told my wrath did end. I was angry with my foe. I told it on my wrath did grow. But then at the end of the poem, it's like, wait, did you kill a dude? Are you confessing to murder here? What you think is a morally instructive lesson becomes, don't end up like me. And you realize, oh, the point of the poem is that the poet failed to heed his own advice, right? He's telling you this from experience. This is what I didn't do. Don't end up like me. Coleridge pulls a similar move here. He tells us this story. Don't be like Kubla Khan. He did something foolish. He disrespected nature. And as if in telling the story, the speaker gets tempted. Like one character after another being tempted by the One Ring in the Lord of the Rings books and films. We can be told, 100 times, the ring is evil. There's no good way to use it. It has to be destroyed. Don't try to use the ring. It's not going to work out well. But no matter how many times we hear this, we see one character after another fall victim to the temptation of the One Ring. When just this once, or I would use it to do something good. It would be different if I did it, but no. And we see that same sort of temptation here, as though the poet in the closing lines is thinking, well, Kubla Khan was a military guy, a macho alpha warlord. I'm a sensitive poet, right? If I tried to harness the power of nature, of the sacred river, the damsel with the dulcimer, whatever form nature is taking. It would be different if I did it, right? I mean, people, nobody pays attention to poetry. Oh, but if I could harness the power of nature and claim it as my own, they'd pay attention to poetry then. I'd have flashing eyes and floating hair and stuff. And people would, sit up and take notice and finally pay attention to poetry because they'd be scared of me. But that is the crucial error. It doesn't matter whether the person who's trying to wall in nature, to tame or to possess the sacred river, the damsel with the dulcimer, doesn't matter whether it's a warlord or a poet doing it. You can never presume that nature works for you or can be totally harnessed or understood. It must be respected, even worshipped from a distance. Okay, well, hour and a half seems like a good amount of time to spend on first generation Romanticism. In the next video, we'll be seeing how the second generation guys, Byron and Shelley and Keats, took the foundation established by Blake, Wordsworth, and Coleridge, and added to it, continued it, augmented it, but also disagreed with it in certain important ways, which is why we bother dividing Romanticism into first and second generations. Okay, let's hope this actually recorded. And what button do I press now? Is it this one?